Dota 2 is a game full of strange heroes. One that is 5, another that is all, and a third that can't do it alone. But arguably, the most eccentric of all is he who creates magic out of thin air, he who has no abilities, and yet the most of all. Invoker, the hero with 10 spells. Invoker, the master of rapid-fire casting and unending cascades of magic. Invoker, beloved by audiences and feared by those who challenge him. Dota 2 has a long and storied history, and today we are going to explore how well Invoker performed at our most important tournaments, the International. So, how good was Karl the Invoker? When magic was still young, mankind struggled with it. The complexity of spells pushed the human limits, and since they had no technology, wands, or other tools available, magic was the art of memory. Rituals were merely mnemonic devices intended to guide the mage through the specifics required for their desired spell. Ordinary wizards were often limited to but one spell, and the greatest were those with minds that could hoard the information required for 3 or maybe even 4 of them. But among these early practitioners, there was one prodigy, a genius with an intellect so vast that he could recall no fewer than 10 spells and cast them instantly. One such magic was the sempiternal cantrip, a spell of quasi-immortality. Over the years, his proficiency earned him the name Invoker, and his endless thirst for knowledge kept him busy since the very beginning of magic. Invoker was first implemented into Dota 2 on the 19th of January 2012. He was a ranged intelligence hero with quite awful attributes. While his attack range was a grade 600, everything else about him was a bit lacking, in particular his movement speed and starting damage. However, these attributes were fixed by his first 3 abilities. Invoker's first 3 abilities were Quas, Vex, and Exhort. They all functioned in the same way, so I'll explain them as a set. When Invoker leveled Quas, Vex, or Exhort, he respectively gained a small amount of bonus strength, agility, or intelligence. Invoker could at any time, without any cooldown or mana cost, summon an instance of these 3 spells, which summoned an orb that visibly floated around him and provided him with a buff. Quas provided health regeneration, Vex bonus attack and movement speed, and Exhort attack damage. These effects stacked per instance, so if Exhort provided 6 damage per instance and he had 2 Exhort instances summoned, he would gain 12 damage. He could have 3 of these summoned at a time, with the oldest one being replaced with the newest one if he continued summoning. So let's say he had Quas, Quas, and Vex summoned. If he then summoned Exhort twice, both the Quas instances would be replaced with Exhort, because they were the oldest ones. This functioned in order, so he would first have Quas, Vex, Exhort, and then Vex, Exhort, Exhort. Each of them could be leveled up 7 times, which impacted not only their own power, but also that of Invoker's other abilities. While Quas, Vex, and Exhort were quite useful in their own right, particularly during the early laning stage, since Invoker could freely buff his damage or health regeneration as was needed, they were only the building blocks for Invoker's actual spells. Invoker's ultimate was Invoke. Unlike all other ultimates, Invoke could be leveled 4 times, with the first level being available at level 2, then at 7, then 12, and finally 17, while normal ultimates became available at 6, 11, and 16. Invoke allowed the hero to craft a spell into his ability bar, depending on which instances of Quas, Vex, or Exhort he currently had summoned. Invoke scaled through its cooldown and how many spells he could invoke. At level 2, it allowed for 1 spell, and at level 7, Invoker gained an additional spell he could have ready, which was the maximum. Invoke had an Aghanim Scepter upgrade that lowered its cooldown and mana cost. Quas invoked Cold Snap. Cold Snap was an undispellable single-target debuff that dealt damage to target enemy and applied a brief 0.4 second stun. Then, for the next couple of seconds, whenever that enemy took damage, Cold Snap would trigger again, applying the same stun and more damage. This damage was fairly high, making this quite a dangerous ability. Cold Snap had an internal cooldown, limiting how often it could trigger. Its duration and internal cooldown scaled with the level of Quas. Cold Snap was a very powerful long-duration disable that synergized nicely with a variety of different items and heroes and Invoker's own abilities. Quas Vex invoked Ghost Walk. Ghost Walk turned Invoker invisible, slowing his movement speed and nearby enemies. The slow applied to nearby enemies scaled with Quas, while his own movement speed modifier scaled with Vex. Slowing enemies like this also bypassed magic immunity. At first, Ghost Walk would slow Invoker, but if Vex was maxed out, it would eventually stop. Unfortunately, Ghost Walk had a huge cooldown of 60 seconds, and slowing yourself wasn't ideal for a getaway tool, making it an unreliable defensive option. And because Invoker visibly slowed nearby enemies, it wasn't great for surprise attacks either. Ghost Walk was one of his less useful spells. Quas Vex invoked Tornado. Tornado summoned a tornado into target direction, which lifted all enemies it hit into the air, dealing damage to them once it dropped them down again. Enemies lifted like this were invincible for the duration. Tornado's distance scaled with higher levels of Vex, eventually becoming very long. The lift time scaled with Quas, and the damage with both Quas and Vex. Because Tornado's damage scaled from both, if Invoker leveled up Quas and Vex early, Tornado could do huge amounts of damage. Tornado also provided vision in a large radius, making it a powerful scouting tool. Vex invoked EMP. EMP created a charging electromagnetic field in target location. It had no effect while charging up, but once it reached its maximum, it released a shock in a huge radius that burned a significant amount of mana of all enemies hit, while dealing pure damage based on the mana lost. EMP's mana burn and delay scaled with Vex. The delay started at 3.7 seconds and went down to 2 seconds. EMP could also hit invincible units, which meant it could hit units that were lifted by Tornado. This made the two abilities a powerful combo, as Tornado set up for EMP to connect and they both scaled off of Vex. Vex Exord invoked Alacrity. Alacrity was a single target buff that enhanced the attack speed and damage of an allied unit for 9 seconds. The attack speed scaled with Vex and the damage with Exord. This buff was quite substantial, turning any hero into a dangerous attacker. Vex Exord invoked Chaos Meteor. Chaos Meteor summoned a flaming meteor from space that crashed a target location and then continued traveling along the floor. Enemies hit by the meteor took damage and were set on fire, taking even more over the next few seconds. This debuff stacked with itself, meaning that the longer a target was touching the Chaos Meteor, the higher the damage they took each second. Because Chaos Meteor was a damage over time effect, it comboed nicely with Cold Snap, and because it had a bit of a delay before landing, Tornado could be used to set it up. The Meteor's travel distance scaled with Vex, and its damage with Exord. Chaos Meteor was a bit difficult to hit, but it did huge damage if it connected. Exord invoked Sunstrike. Sunstrike allowed Invoker to target any location on the map, where after a 1.7 second delay, he would deal a high amount of burst magic damage. Sunstrike's damage scaled with Exord. The AoE for Sunstrike was very small, and the damage it dealt was shared evenly among any targets it hit. This made it a precision tool that required careful aiming to be effective. Ideally, his team coordinated with Invoker to stun their target before he cast Sunstrike on it. While this was a bit high maintenance, it was undeniably worth it, as Sunstrike did a huge amount of damage for an ability with global cast range. Invoker could continue to farm in lane while helping anywhere else on the map. Sunstrike by itself made Exord Invoker worth considering. Exord Quas invoked Forge Spirits. Forge Spirits summoned a ranged Forge Spirit that Invoker could control freely. The stats of the Forge Spirit depended on Invoker's levels of Exhort and Quas. Higher levels of Exhort increased their damage, health, and armor, while higher levels of Quas increased their attack range, mana, and duration. Forge Spirits used mana when they attacked, as they applied a debuff that reduced their target's armor. If both Quas and Exhort were at least level 4, then Invoker summoned 2 Forge Spirits instead of just 1. The Forge Spirits were quite powerful, because unlike most other summons, they continued scaling for a significant portion of the game as Invoker was leveling up Quas and Exhort. They also had nice synergy with Alacrity, as their armor-reducing debuff and high attack range made them great targets for the attack speed boost, and Invoker could always just buff himself and then punch people after the Forge Spirits had reduced their armor. Exhort Quas invoked Ice Wall. Ice Wall created a wide field of ice in front of Invoker, which damaged and slowed enemies that touched it. Its damage scaled with Exhort, while its duration and slow scaled with Quas. Ice Wall was an unwieldy ability, as it was only effective directly in front of Invoker. While its slow was powerful, properly connecting with it was a rarity, and as such it was widely considered to be Invoker's worst ability. Finally, Exhort Quas Vex invoked Deafening Blast. Deafening Blast released a sonic wave in target direction that dealt damage to all enemies hit, knocked them back, and disarmed them. The knockback duration was in effect a stun, as enemies couldn't act during it. The damage scaled with Exhort, the knockback with Quas, and the disarm duration with Vex. Deafening Blast was not only very powerful in its own right, but it also synergized nicely with Invoker's other abilities. It could push opponents into Chaos Meteor or Ice Wall, it protected himself or his Forge Spirits, and it gave him time to attack with Alacrity. Deafening Blast wasn't the most immediately powerful ability in Invoker's kit, but because it scaled no matter which build he went for, it was one of the most consistently useful ones. Invoker was a hero all about mastering his multitude of powerful spells. Invoking the correct abilities repeatedly in the middle of a fight was quite tricky. Casting the right spells on the right targets while managing all of their collective cooldowns, mana costs, and your own health and positioning made for a hero that attracted perfectionists. Following his implementation, Invoker actually received a handful of changes before his first tournament. Chaos Meteor had its land time reduced and damage increased. Sunstrike's damage type was changed from magical to pure, an effective increase of at least 25% damage, and it now revealed the targeted area before the damage impact. This last change primarily improved the theatrics of the ability, which was important. Invoker being a stylish, exciting hero was a big part of his identity and defined the kind of players that were attracted to him. EMP also had its cooldown increased and was changed to no longer hit invulnerable units, which meant Invoker now had to time the ability if he wanted to combo it with Tornado. This was still absolutely possible, just a bit more difficult. Tornado also had its cooldown increased and its damage decreased. Despite Exhort abilities getting buffed and Vex spells getting nerfed, at the International 2, Invoker primarily played Quas Vex. I will be describing Invoker using language like this. When I say Quas Vex, I mean that Invoker skilled Quas and Vex during the early game and focused his item build around the attributes and spells enabled by these two components. However, that doesn't mean he never skilled Exhort. Even when playing Quas Vex, Exhort was still part of his kit, and he would always skill it in the mid to late game. The same would be true if I were to say Quas Exhort or Vex Exhort. At TI2, Invoker took on the role of a solo laner that focused on getting levels as quickly as possible. That meant he often played the mid, but also sometimes reasonably difficult solo side lanes. As long as Invoker could survive in a lane and get experience, then that was okay, even if he didn't get much farm. Since all of his abilities scaled for the entire game, he had an easy time staying relevant so long as he earned enough experience. Unfortunately, this meant that often, the hero going up against Invoker would have a rather easy time laning, as the Quas Vex Invoker didn't have great tools for applying pressure. Quas gave him health regeneration and Vex movement speed, both of which were great for surviving in a lane and defensive plays, but since he was skipping Exhort, his actual damage for harassment and kill attempts was quite low. The same applied to his spells, as early on, Quas and Vex invocations primarily offered defensive utility. And so, during the early game, Invoker often seemed like a lackluster hero that only contributed by not actively feeding. But once he made it past that early struggle, Invoker became an impactful team fighter that enabled his allies with a multitude of powerful disables. Cold Snap was a lengthy, repeatedly stunning debuff that couldn't be dispelled. Tornado had a huge cast range, which was useful for scouting and catching people off guard, and its damage was also substantial. EMP synergized greatly with both of them, as they kept Invoker's targets in place, and EMP then did further damage and burned their mana, which at the time was a limited resource. Heroes just didn't have access to that much mana, and EMP making a serious dent in a team's mana pool could have a huge impact on the outcome of fights. EMP was particularly useful against heroes that relied on their mana pool, most importantly against Morphling, one of the top heroes of the tournament. And Deafening Blast's knockback and disarm duration scaled with Quas and Vex, which made it another powerful disable. The disarm applied by it also didn't get dispelled by magic immunity, which could make it hugely impactful in the right moments. These were his primary abilities that defined his purpose in a team. His main job was to sit in the back and constantly spam those 4 spells to their maximum effect. These 4 abilities all had long cast ranges, which meant Invoker could focus on keeping his distance, which his item build also leaned into. Phase Boots into Force Staff into Hex. All about movement, distance, and disables. With just Phase Boots and high levels of Vex, Invoker became very fast, which made catching him difficult. Ghostwalk also assisted him in his defense, as it allowed him to quickly disappear and reposition if his enemies didn't carry detection. In a weird way, Invoker was a kind of support. Not that he bought any wards, he spent most of the game farming. But in fights, his emphasis was on enabling and protecting his carries. He was good at this, and during the first era of Dota, carries were crucially important, meaning dedicating one of your cores to just enabling your main carry was a fine strategy. Especially since, unlike other supporting heroes, Invoker only became stronger the longer a game went on, as he gained more levels and unlocked more spells. He was considered a semi-carry, which meant he could scale alongside the carry he was enabling. However, while Invoker was good at the task he was given, he often found himself targeted down early. And even if he wasn't killed, his impact just wasn't that high. This was because Invoke simply wasn't good. It had a very long cooldown, 22 seconds at level 1, then 17, 12, and finally 5. While at maximum level, Invoke was quite spammable, before that point, it could only be used once or twice per fight. Invoker players would prepare 2 spells ahead of time, then invoke a 3rd spell after using the prepared ones, and then they prayed that they survived long enough to cast a 4th one. His abilities were undeniably powerful, but he could only use a small number of them each fight. Invoker limited himself to only a few spells because unless he had already reached level 17, he didn't have much of a choice. It was safer for his team to build a game plan around 3 to 4 abilities, because anything more than that required very long teamfights. A small handful of competitors also tried to go in a bit of a different direction and play Quasic Sword Invoker. This build focused on the burst damage and global presence provided by Sunstrike to give Invoker's team a powerful early laning stage, as any fights could easily be supplemented with significant damage. Ganks often started with a stun getting thrown at the target, which, when properly coordinated, gave Invoker the opportunity to line up a Sunstrike for a hefty chunk of extra pain. Exort also provided him the benefit of actually giving a useful attribute during the laning stage, as damage was much more relevant than movement or attack speed early on. Exort Invoker had a much easier time last hitting and applying lane pressure. During pushes and Roshan attempts, his Forged Spirits contributed relevant damage, and the Deafening Blast Chaos Meteor combo was always threatening. However, this build offered much less in terms of defense. Players using it often only leveled Vex once before maxing out the other 2 orbs. This stemmed from that same issue of Invoke having too long of a cooldown. While Quas Vex Invoker could at least try to run away with Ghostwalk, all Quas Exort Invoker could muster was Ice Wall, which was decidedly his worst ability. Quas Exort also didn't have the same cast ranges as Quas Vex and usually needed to get much closer to the action. Since Invoker was a semi-carry, a hero who didn't get the same level of consideration as the true carry, he needed to be more independent and be able to defend himself, which was something the Exort build struggled with. At the International too, Invoker was one of the most popular heroes in the game, contested in 142 matches, over 92% of the tournament. However, his win rate wasn't great at 46%. I would usually say that 46% was well within regular standard variation, but Invoker was genuinely picked in 81 matches, which meant that those 46% actually represented a bit of an underperformance. And this is also what I observed in the matches I saw. While he really had a horrible game, he just wasn't all that impactful even when he was doing well. So why was he so popular then? At the time, there weren't a lot of heroes that could reliably protect an allied carry. Oracle wasn't in the game, neither was Winter Wyvern, and even Abaddon hadn't been added yet. Invoker wasn't great at protecting his allies, but there just weren't a lot of other options. And so, TI2 was a weird success, as he was one of the most highly drafted heroes around. Allow me to interrupt. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video so far. If you have, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. This is the last regular Stories of Dota video, so if we've ever earned it, maybe it's today. Thank you very much for watching, and let's continue on. Afterwards, Invoker had his base damage reduced by 4 in patch 6.75. This may not seem like a huge reduction, but the way Invoker was primarily played at TI2 had already resulted in a very limited laning presence. Reducing the laning presence of the Quas Vex build even further hit him where it hurt. 6.78 then reduced the mana cost of Alacrity and the cooldown of Ghostwalk. It also increased the slow from Ghostwalk and rescaled Tornado's damage to deal more damage with higher levels of Vex, but less when both Quas and Vex were being maxed out. At the International 3, Invoker was only picked once. This was a sharp decline in popularity, which I think proves how much Invoker was teetering on that edge. A small reduction in his laning prowess had him effectively disappear from the competitive scene. But let's focus on what he actually did in that one game. He was played by Ice, who was one of the few Quas Exort Invoker players from the previous year. Quas Exort was also the build that he used in this match, which allowed him to compensate for the loss in damage as he took on the mid lane. One thing that differentiated Ice from the other players was that he was quite greedy and seemingly didn't care much for the label of semi-carry. Instead, he focused on farming selfishly and even purchased an early hand of Midas. This was a particularly important item, as it helped him level up quicker, which meant higher levels of Invoke. The Forged Spirits were also great for farming, as they could help him tackle multiple areas at once, or push out lanes that were too risky for Invoker himself. In teamfights, the core Exort strategy was a bit different from Quas Vex. Exort spells didn't have the same range as Tornado or EMP, and in the case of Alacrity and Forged Spirits, even required simple attacking. As such, Exort Invoker needed to be much closer to the action, which put him into a more dangerous position. However, I got the impression that despite the hero's decline in popularity, Ice had continued practicing Invoker, as his proficiency was much higher than what we had seen before. Just look at how cleanly he played this teamfight. And so, he didn't have the same issues that previous Invoker players encountered, as he compensated for a lack of mobility with good play. Invoker's skill build had also been improved, now prioritizing an early level into Vex, then getting Quas and Exort each to level 4 to summon 2 Forged Spirits, then maxing out Exort and then Vex. This last step was a huge variation from what was done before. By not fully committing into Quas Exort, Ice got earlier access to all of Invoker's abilities at a reasonable power level, and because he played the hero as a carry with Hand of Midas, he often had enough levels to actually use all of those spells. Another small change was that he opted for strength power treads over face boots, which gave him more raw health that allowed him to better stand his ground in fights. While at TI3, Invoker was only picked once. In that one game, Ice demonstrated that he had continued practicing the hero, as he made Invoker a much more formidable active presence than the supporting style from before. Ice's team won this game, and not in small part due to him. Invoker may not have been popular, but maybe there was more to him than appeared at first glance. Over the next year, Invoker received quite a few changes. The first and most important of all was that Invoker no longer required level 7 to queue up 2 spells. This allowed Invoker access to an additional ability during the early game, which was a huge deal and significantly increased his laning power. Then, his invocations also received a couple of adjustments. EMP had its mana burn increased and its delay normalized to 2.6 seconds, which was later nerfed to 2.9. EMP also started restoring mana to Invoker, equal to 50% of the total mana drained. Forge Spirits, surprisingly, despite not seeing noteworthy play at TI so far, were nerfed quite heavily. Their armor was reduced by 2 points, they lost all of their magic resistance and 210 attack range at max level. Ghostwalk was both buffed and nerfed. It could now actually increase Invoker's movement speed at high levels, finally turning it into an actual defensive option, as even if detected, Invoker could use the movement speed boost to run away, but it no longer bypassed magic immunity with its slow. Similarly, Deafening's Blast Disarm could now be dispelled by magic immunity. Finally, Cold Snap had its damage rescaled, becoming weaker early but stronger late, as it now scaled with levels of Quas, and Alacrity had its mana cost reduced. The International 4 was heavily defined by pushing strategies. While Deathbolt pushing ended up prevailing, the more traditional approach of methodically breaking down all outer towers before attempting a base push at 30 to 35 minutes was still popular. Invoker became very common in such teams as he fundamentally changed his playstyle from TI2. Quas Vex Invoker was dead. Instead, Quas Exort took over entirely. Quas Exort Invoker prioritized Sunstrike, Cold Snap, and most importantly, Forge Spirits. Forge Spirits were a very powerful summon. During the laning stage, they had noteworthy health, range, and damage, while amplifying further attack damage by applying a minus armor debuff. Before, Invoker had been a mediocre defensive laner that was centered around survival, but Exort provided him with tremendous early attack damage and Quas health regeneration. Combined, they let him favorably trade hits with his opponents and then heal quicker than they could. Invoker was now expected to win his lane, and he usually did so. Something that helped a lot in this respect as well was that Invoker didn't need to skill Invoke at level 7 anymore. He already gained access to 2 spells at level 2, and the cooldown of Invoke didn't decrease impactfully until at least level 12, but really level 17. In a way, he gained a free level. Invoker started completely skipping the level 7 Invoke, and instead maxed out Quas and Exort earlier. By level 9, he now gained access to the double Forge Spirit summon, and at level 10, he would invest at least 1 point into Vex, which enabled his full set of skills. This new approach to Invoker made him immediately threatening, and most importantly, threatening by himself. He was no longer a semi-carry, but instead a fully fledged core. Invoker then used his early power to help his team push. The Forge Spirits were fantastic summons to help deal damage and bolster the health pool of a siege, and Alacrity added incredible damage to either Invoker, one of his allies, or even a summon. His item build also played into this. Hand of Midas became very popular. It provided him with some attack speed, which was relevant because of his high Exort enhanced attack damage, and more importantly, it was a farming item that didn't require actual farming time, meaning Invoker could participate in fights and pushes without falling behind. Afterwards, he most commonly purchased a Necronomicon. Necronomicon was an item that summoned 2 minions, one of which was a powerful frontliner that burned mana on attack and dealt huge burst damage if killed, and the other a useful utility unit that carried a beneficial movement and attack speed boosting aura and mana burned opponents with its ability. Necronomicon was a strange item because it was purchased as a weak version of itself and could be upgraded twice by buying its recipe again. This made it affordable for the early mid-game while staying relevant as the game progressed. A very fast Necronomicon free could feel almost as impactful as an entire hero. The Necronomicon melee unit also had another unique property, having the lowest base attack time of any unit in the entire game at 0.75. It scaled extremely aggressively with attack speed and damage buffs, like Alacrity. An early Necronomicon free warrior unit with Alacrity on it could genuinely solo kill a lot of heroes. While they would fall off if the game went on for too long, pushing strategies tried to win before it got to that stage. During fights, Invoker now relied on damage over disables. This was a much more sensible plan, because if you only got to cast a handful of spells, then making those as damaging as possible to end the fight quickly was more effective than playing a protective role. Forge Spirits also helped bypass Invoke's long cooldown, as they could be summoned well ahead of the fight. The downside was that without Vex, Invoker had limited ways to disengage fights. Usually he had to simply hold his ground, hoping to win the brawl or die in battle. But this is not to downplay his effectiveness. Invoker was incredibly powerful. He worked great as a part of pushing strategies, not only because he had powerful early summons and dangerous spells, but also because he wouldn't fall off if his team didn't manage to win in time. Like before, Invoker only became more powerful the longer a game went on, as eventually he would level up Invoke and start spamming a barrage of spells in every fight. This is where it's also worth noting that players had gotten visibly better at the hero. They played with much more confidence and landed stun strikes and meteor combos that they hadn't before. At the International 4, Invoker was fantastic. He was contested in 64 matches, just a bit over 37% of the tournament, with a solid 51% win rate. While we focused on his part in pushing teams, Exort Invoker was a strong enough laner that he saw plenty of play outside of those strategies, relying purely on his raw damage output to contribute to his team's game plan. He always performed well in his games and was frequently the most valuable hero on his team. Following TI4, Dota 2's economy was reworked in a way that invalidated pushing-centric strategies and instead placed emphasis on ganking and teamfighting. A couple of new items were also added, most notably Octarine Core, which was an expensive late-game caster item that provided spell lifesteal and cooldown reduction. Invoker himself only received a handful of changes. Tornado had its flying vision reduced and its damage adjusted to be only dependent on Vex, as opposed to being a mixture of Quas and Vex. This weakened the spell during the early game, as no matter which build Invoker chose, Quas was mandatory. Sunstrike had its cooldown reduced and started piercing spell immunity. Deafening Blast now became a circular AoE around Invoker if he had everything maxed out, and Invoke no longer went on cooldown if all Invoker did was swap the order of his abilities. For example, if he had Cold Snap and Sunstrike invoked, he could invoke Sunstrike again to change the order to Sunstrike and Cold Snap without Invoke going on cooldown. Finally, he gained a fairly significant amount of intelligence growth. At the International 5, a unique style of supporting centered around stacking and defending the jungle was popular. I like to call these kinds of supports jungle supports. Jungle supports often didn't have a dedicated lane that they would go back to in between stack timings, and instead they roamed around the map. However, because of the natural flow of movement between lanes, they would often find themselves in the mid lane. As a result, significant portions of many games were played in 2 vs 2 mid matchups. Dual mid lanes like this were awful for Invoker because they limited his experience gain. While Invoker wanted money, he could make do with limited resources, as long as he had enough experience to strengthen his spells. Experience, however, was non-negotiable, especially now as the new meta put more emphasis on fighting. Mid laners were expected and required to be powerful damage dealers. They couldn't take on a backline supporting role. Invoker was picked 4 times, and out of those matches, he only got to play a single proper solo mid. And even there, the lane was quite busy at multiple points. Pushing as a primary strategy had vanished, and with the mid lane so contested, Invoker was a bit lost. His Exort style from TI4 and his support style from TI2 were both outdated. The higher focus on fighting also made the long cooldown of Invoke more relevant and worse than ever before. And so, the International 5 was a letdown. The only noteworthy thing that happened for him was that Urn of Shadows started seeing use for the first time. Urn was a cheap early game item that, amongst other options, applied a debuff on target opponent that dealt damage over time. The important thing for Invoker was that this debuff triggered Cold Snap, making it an easy way to repeatedly stun with it. This was a good combo, but nowhere near enough to push him into relevance. Invoker was picked 4 times, losing all of those games while putting on a frankly embarrassing performance. Nobody was happy with this, least of all Valve. A huge number of changes followed across all of the next patches. At first, Invoker was majorly buffed. 6.85 increased his int game by another 0.8. He now gained a massive 4 intelligence per level, giving him enormous base damage and an amazing mana pool. His Aghanim Scepter was also buffed, now adding 1 level to Quas, Vex and Exhort. This made it much stronger than it had been, effectively giving Invoker 3 additional level ups and letting him reach an even more impressive peak in the late game. Alacrity also had its attack damage and speed boost increased. Then in 6.86, Invoke was reworked to always be available from level 1, without needing to be leveled up at all, and its leveling was adjusted to be the standard 6, 11 and 16. Along with this, Invoker now gained a bonus 6 all stats at level 25. This Invoke rework further reduced the number of levels Invoker needed to be effective. These changes were incredibly successful, making Invoker an amazing hero. And so he was nerfed repeatedly over the next few patches. Alacrity had its early values reduced, but later ones strengthened. Deafening Blast had its mana cost increased, and no longer acted as a stun, but a simple knockback during which casting items and abilities was still possible, but in turn its disarm duration was increased. Cold Snap became dispellable. Ghost Walk had its cooldown increased by 10 seconds, Tornado's vision radius was decreased again, this time all the way down to 200, and finally, Forge Spirits had their health and mana scaling swapped and their damage decreased. This made them much less effective when deployed by a pure Exhort build. Invoker himself also received a number of changes to his stats. His base strength, agility and intelligence were all drastically reduced. However, he received a base damage increase equal to the intelligence lost, so his starting damage stayed the same. All of his invoked spells also gained a tiny, minimal cast point. This mattered because Invoker had to stop moving to cast his spells now, but it wasn't overly impactful because the cast point was so short. At the International 6, Invoker continued playing the mid lane. Quas Exhort was by far his most popular approach, as it made him one of the stronger mid laners in the game. Beating Invoker fairly was very difficult, and so he was frequently targeted by aggressive rotations which he was weak against. He also continued to struggle if he was forced into a dual mid lane, something he wanted to avoid at all costs, which inherently limited his pick rate. This meant that Invoker's early game varied. Sometimes he could lane in the way he wanted to, and then he did great, but often he got ganked repeatedly and came out of the laning stage in a bad position. And unfortunately, his team couldn't really help him, since if they did, they took away valuable experience. He tried to make up for these weaker openings with a Hand of Midas, a very popular item for him, as it helped guarantee a baseline level of farm even if he had a bad start. Then he liked buying some stat-giving items, usually Drums of Endurance and then Aghanim Scepter. His new Aghanims was very powerful and the main reason to play the hero. Keep in mind that the 3 additional levels it now offered came in addition to the cooldown reduction to invoke it already provided. If he got Aghanim Scepter, he could do tremendous damage while constantly throwing impactful disables. His other late game options also embraced spells. Lincoln Sphere for defense, Blink Dagger for positioning, or Octarine Core to lower the cooldowns of his abilities. Thanks to his new scepter, he could actually fully depend on his spells without needing to find a different way to be useful. And his spells were undeniably good. Their damage, their range of options, their late game scaling. If Invoker got the levels and items he needed, he was a monster. But if he didn't, and if his team was under too much pressure, he couldn't save them. The tempo playstyle from earlier years wasn't relevant anymore, and his new tools took time to become available. Not a huge amount of time. Invoker could come online by 30 minutes, as Aghanim Scepter wasn't that expensive. But that was still gold and experience he needed to find first, which could be difficult if his opponents played aggressively into this window of opportunity. Setting that aside, one team actually brought back TI2 Invoker. MVP played Quas Vex to enable their carry Phantom Assassin. In those games, Invoker's job was to disable anybody that might interfere with QO relentlessly charging people down, and Vex was needed for him to keep up with that unending aggression. Literally needed, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to run quickly enough. While this was interesting, it wasn't hugely effective. The team that got the most out of Invoker overall was Digital Chaos, who played him 6 times as regular Quasic Sword and won 5 of those matches, performing well. Overall, the International 6 was a bit hit or miss for Invoker. He wasn't bad by any means, but he also required more than most teams were willing to invest into their mid laner. Usually it was supposed to be the other way around, that the mid enabled the team, not that the team enabled the mid. And so, Invoker was a good character, but not a great one. He was contested in 43 games, about 27% of the tournament, with a 50% win rate. At the end of 2016, one of the most memorable patches of all time was released, 7.0. Dota 7.0 brought many changes to the game as a whole, like a new map and the addition of talents. It also included various bigger and smaller hero reworks. Invoker was the beneficiary of one of those. Invoke was changed to be an innate ability that neither required levels or even could be leveled. Instead, it always had a 6-second cooldown and a 60 mana cost. His Aghanim Scepter was also adjusted to now always reduce the Invoke cooldown to 2 seconds. In turn, Invoker no longer gained bonus attributes from his orbs or when reaching level 25, and Deafening Blast no longer became radial when all orbs reached level 7. But the bonus damage from Exhort and bonus health regen from Quas were increased a bit to compensate. EMP also had its damage slightly increased and its type changed from pure to magical. The final inclusion of 7.0 were talents. Invoker's first talent tree was quite alright, with one particularly intriguing addition. Plus 20% experience gain at level 15 was incredible for a hero as experience hungry as Invoker. And, to his delight, this talent was even buffed over the next couple of patches until it was at plus 30% bonus experience. The only unfortunate thing about it was that it shared the same slot as plus 1 Forge Spirits summoned, which meant that Invoker had to severely limit the power of his Forge Spirits to use it. But at the same time, he no longer needed to level up Quas to 4, since double Forge Spirits became independent of that. This meant it was a bit of a toss-up. Some players preferred the fighting power from Forge Spirits, while others opted for the experience gain to scale quicker. Either way, Invoker had a difficult relationship with his talent tree. As already mentioned, his talents were pretty solid, but Invoker really wanted to level up his orbs, and so investing points into talents came at a heavier price for him than for most other heroes. It wasn't unusual for Invoker to delay his early talents. This was something that varied from game to game, from player to player. Aside from this, Invoker received some minor changes to his general attributes, mana costs, and cooldowns. At TI7, Invoker continued his evolution towards a fast-paced late-game spell slinger. Because Invoke didn't need to be leveled up anymore, he gained access to multiple spells per fight from the very beginning of the game. His skill build changed to Quasic Sword until level 7 and then Vexic Sword from there. The goal was to create a solid baseline of utility from all of his abilities while maximizing their damage output. Then, Hand of Midas into Aghanim Scepter into defensive and utility-centered casting items. Once he got there, Invoker was incredibly powerful. He could start fighting earlier than ever before, and the impact of his dangerous spells was felt by both teams. However, that's assuming the early game went okay for him. Invoker still needed levels, he still had to find enough money for that Aghanim Scepter. But at TI7, dual mid lanes were still a normal strategy, and they were brutal for him. During Liquid vs Virtus Pro, Miracle started jungling instead of staying in the lane, as he simply couldn't compete there. That's not to say that Invoker was a bad laner. He was very strong in 1 vs 1 matchups, but he couldn't find those as often as he wanted to. Some attempts at different styles of laning were made, like for example Sumail played one game of Vexic Sword, which is noteworthy because it's the first time anybody has ever tried this. This was actually brutal in the laning stage, as he could abuse Alacrity immediately for tremendous laning power, but it still couldn't fix the issue of getting overwhelmed by multiple heroes. Invoker was undeniably stronger than last year, and his impact could be felt more visibly, but the meta applied pressure in ways that he had a hard time dealing with. Picking Invoker required taking risks and commitments that many teams would rather avoid. And so he was still middling in popularity, sitting at 42 contested games, around 22% of the tournament, with a 47% win rate. During this era, Invoker found himself in an awkward spot. He was decidedly a dangerous hero, but the meta just wasn't right for him. Not too long after TI7, Invoker had his talent tree reworked. He lost most of his generic talents and instead gained a multitude of useful upgrades to his abilities. Particularly interesting was the Cataclysm talent he could choose at level 20. Cataclysm was basically a new ability, although closely connected to Sunstrike. With this talent, Invoker could double-click Sunstrike to cast Cataclysm. Cataclysm then summoned 2 Sunstrikes aimed at each opposing hero, placed a slight distance away from them. There was a small random factor to this, as the distance of the Sunstrikes varied a bit. His opponents could also see the Sunstrikes coming, giving them a chance to evade. However, given some good luck in the spread of Sunstrikes and the positioning of his opponents, Invoker could hit each of them with 2 Sunstrikes, which dealt tremendous damage. And even if he didn't, landing even just 1 Sunstrike on 2 or 3 heroes was already very powerful. Sunstrike had always been a really good ability, but its use in teamfights was limited, as they were too hectic to properly line targets up with the delay. Cataclysm, on the other hand, required no targeting and was an immediate cast that he could throw out at any time. It could also synergize with his other abilities or disables from his teammates to line up devastating combo plays. Cataclysm was a welcome addition to his kit, but at first it was a bit unreliable. However, over the next few months, Cataclysm was repeatedly buffed, reducing the spread and the distance the Sunstrikes were apart, meaning it became a very dangerous ability. Another important change was that Invoke had its mana cost first reduced and then removed entirely. Aside from that, his talents saw some mild increases and he gained 2 extra base strength. Finally, among the new items added during this period was Spirit Vessel, a powerful upgrade to Urn of Shadows that added healing manipulation to its active ability. When used on an opponent, it reduced their healing, and when used on an ally, it amplified it. These new buffs were fantastic and enabled Invoker to perform spectacularly at the International 8. Invoke never had a high mana cost, but because he had to use it every time he wanted to cast a spell, it quickly added up, particularly during the early game. But now that it was free, he could invoke without a worry in the world. This allowed for huge freedom in his skill builds. While both the traditional Quas Vex and Quas Exort builds were popular, many players adjusted freely to what was needed. Early single levels into all 3 orbs to access all spells were common, and they weren't hard rules anymore like the previous 4 levels of Quas and Exort before going into Vex. Invoker could build however he wanted to, in any order. But there were still noticeable patterns. Quas Vex Invoker returned as he was an excellent user of Spirit Vessel because it comboed with Cold Snap for repeated stuns. This was important because Spirit Vessel was indispensable against teams that relied on powerful healing abilities from heroes like Io, Necrophos and Huskar. Invoker could lane well against those characters and then use Spirit Vessel and his vast array of disables to stop them from healing, then controlled them and killed them. How many levels of Quas Vex he got exactly before dipping into Exort varied quite a bit, always adjusting to the pace of the game. Another, slightly less common approach was 2 levels of Quas, 3 levels of Exort, and then alternating between Vex and Exort. This build relied on Invoker's strong laning presence to build quick momentum for an early Aghanim Scepter. Hand of Midas had fallen out of favor, as it wasn't necessary anymore for Invoker to perform well, as finally, dual mid lanes were becoming a thing of the past. Post 7.0, the offlane became increasingly more important, requiring a support to function effectively. And since the supports were busy playing the offlane, past the point of occasional ganks, they couldn't annoy Invoker in the mid anymore. Basically nobody could beat Invoker in a 1 vs 1, and so he always came out of the laning stage in terrific shape, which he channeled into fast farming and aggression. Past the Scepter, more fighting-based items like Blinkdagger and BKB were becoming the norm. This let him position himself better to line up his skill shots and even just attack his opponents. Alacrity by itself was enough to make him a threatening right-clicker because his huge intelligence gain and the baseline bonus damage from Exhort gave him quite solid attack damage. And of course, he still scaled excellently into the late game, not only since all of his abilities leveled up when he did, but also because Cataclysm was a terrifying ability, and I'm frankly baffled it ever was a simple talent, let alone a talent at only level 20. Cataclysm's damage was so high that it could win a teamfight by itself, and since Invoker wanted fast levels anyways, he got it basically for free. Finally, and I understand this isn't really quantifiable, but if you see it, you'll believe me, the Invoker players were insane at this tournament. They were landing Sunstrikes into the fog across the entire map, crushed whole teams with Chaos Meteor, and timed their disables perfectly to assist their allies. Their positioning was aggressive but calculated, and their invocations quick and accurate. There were so many legendary competitors running absolutely wild. Miracle, Wii, and of course, Thompson. At the International 8, Invoker stomped the competition. He wasn't the most popular hero, at only 53 contested games, about 27% of the tournament, but his win rate was an incredible 66%. He won 2/3 of his matches, and when he did, it really was him that won those games. Invoker's performance was nothing short of amazing, and he should have seen even more play than he did. The only reason why he didn't was because Invoker was hard to play and has had some bad previous years, and that inherently lowers the pick rate of any character. But either way, this was an amazing year for Invoker. Surprisingly, over the next couple of months, Invoker mostly got buffed. His intelligence gain was increased even further, now reaching an absurd 4.6, and he gained 6 additional base damage. In turn, Exor provided less bonus damage. He also gained an extra point of starting int and base armor, and Cold Snap had its damage slightly increased. On top of that, his talents were made better across the board in significant ways. Most important of all, at level 15, he could now reduce the cooldown of Cold Snap by 15 seconds, pushing it down to only a 5-second cooldown. At the International 9, an overpowered talent took hold of Invoker. Quaspex became by far the most common playstyle, as spamming a high-level 5-second cooldown Cold Snap was simply oppressive. Dual mids had also completely disappeared by now, so he always got to play the lane he wanted to. Mid Invoker didn't change much. Spirit Vessel, Aghanim Scepter, BKB. Quaspex early, then start weaving in Exhort as he approached level 20 for Cataclysm. In fights, just spam Cold Snap as often as possible. A 5-second cooldown on an ability that disruptive was unbearable to play against. It was so effective that it opened up the door to something similar but also very different. TI9 marked the first and only time Support Invoker saw significant play. Support Invoker was a Quas Vex Invoker that played as a lane support. His goal was a quick earn of shadows, and then he used his disables to try to be impactful. This didn't always work. Support Invoker was often less than stellar, as his abilities simply didn't have the impact of those from a regular support. Invoker's spells scaled with levels, which also meant that if he was playing a supporting role and didn't get a lot of experience, his spells were kind of bad, with one notable exception. Cold Snap. Cold Snap was always just good. That's why over the past decade, Invoker had basically never skipped quasts. Urn of Shadows and then Spirit Vessel were also just good items to have on a team. Healing Reduction was a very valuable ability, and at the time, no other item provided it. And while Invoker was a weaker early game support, unlike most others, he could scale effectively with only experience. So long as he hit level 15 at some point during the match, he was going to be very powerful for the rest of the game. Quasvex Invoker also relied a lot on Tornado and EMP, both of which were very long-range abilities. And unlike most other supports, Invoker could use Ghost Walk to escape. All this increased his odds of finding the experience he needed. Eventually, he would then invest a point into Exhort, which enabled Deafening Blast, another valuable disable, and Alacrity. Alacrity was an important element of support Invoker, as even without high levels of Exhort, the attack speed boost provided by it was incredibly valuable when placed on the right carry. The best allies were right-clickers that benefited highly from attack speed, like Sven, Slark, and most of all, Tiny. Invoker Tiny was a popular combination, as Tiny had huge damage but low attack speed, which Invoker could fix. Invoker's barrage of disables also enabled Tiny's Aghanim Scepter. If you would like to learn more about that, please watch our dedicated Tiny video. Support Invoker was a disruptive disabler that placed a powerful buff on his carries. But I don't want to oversell you on this build. Support Invoker was a novelty. Yes, everything I mentioned was true, but there wasn't really a good reason to pick it. Other supports could do the same thing, while not being as dependent on experience. While at first, Support Invoker was the more popular style, as the tournament came to a close, it stopped getting picked and classic Mid Invoker took over again. Personally, I think that was the right call, because Support Invoker just wasn't performing well. Despite the win rate of the style being slightly positive, the impact he had on games was minimal. Overall, the International 9 was a weird year for Invoker. He was contested in 43% matches, about 22% of the tournament, with a solid 53% win rate. Like before, he was a good hero, but not outstandingly so. But there was a bigger tragedy in this tournament. The heavy focus on Quasvex shifted emphasis away from the stylish and exciting Invoker play of last year. Invoker became boring to watch, and that wasn't right. That's the only thing Invoker shouldn't be. Patch 7.23 then reworked Invoke slightly. Its cooldown was increased to 7 seconds, but now whenever Invoker leveled up one of his orbs, Invoke's cooldown would decrease by 0.3 seconds. Setting aside talents, this resulted in a 4-second cooldown at level 10, 1.9 seconds at level 17, and 0.7 seconds at maximum level. An incredible buff, not only because of his increased late game potential, but also because Invoker no longer needed to rush Aghanim Scepter. But he might still want to, as Cataclysm became his new Aghanim Scepter upgrade. Aside from that, he received a couple of changes to his talents. Cataclysm was obviously replaced, and the level 15 Cold Snap talent was also nerfed to only minus 10 seconds cooldown. Invoker received a large number of talent changes across the next 2 years. For the sake of brevity, I'll focus on only the ones that were interesting. 7.28 removed the extra Forge Spirit spawn talent and made it a part of the core ability again. Like before, Invoker now spawned 2 Forge Spirits if both Quas and Exhort were at least level 4. The Forged Spirits also had their base attack time improved and no longer used mana for their armor reducing debuff. And in 7.30, Invoker received a new level 25 talent that multiplied the bonuses handed out by Quas, Vex and Exhort by 2.5. This was a fairly huge increase to his general attributes. 7.28 also added the Aghanim's Shard, which provided each hero with either a new spell or a buff to an existing ability. Invoker's first Aghanim's Shard upgraded Ice Wall, causing it to become a vector-targeted ability. This allowed Invoker to freely place Ice Wall, which had always been his worst spell because of how difficult it was to actually hit a target with it. In that way, the Shard fixed Ice Wall's biggest problem, but while it was certainly an improvement, it didn't help too much as Ice Wall remained underwhelming. And so in 7.29, his Shard was reworked to now summon 2 extra Chaos Meteors whenever Chaos Meteor was cast, while also reducing its cooldown. Now this was a proper Invoker ability, big and flashy and exciting. 7.29 also reintroduced bonus attributes to all heroes to fill the empty levels in the late game. But because of his orbs, Invoker didn't have empty levels, so he had bonus attributes added to his orbs. Quas provided +2 strength per level, Vex +2 agility, and Exhort +2 intelligence. Since this strengthened his early game a lot, he had the regen from Quas, the bonus attack speed from Vex, and the bonus damage from Exhort nerfed appropriately. But keep in mind, he still had the multiplication talent at level 25, which worked on these attributes. After 7.29, Invoker was in a really good spot. He was very powerful, and so over the next few patches, a large number of his spells were slightly nerfed, mostly centered around reducing his late game power. At the International 10, Invoker was well positioned among the most feared heroes of the competition. He returned to playing exclusively the solo mid, and he performed excellently in that role. Quas Vex continued to be his most popular style. Invoker's base damage and intelligence growth were so good now that he didn't even need Exhort to win his lane anymore. The only thing he had to worry about were ganks, but Quas Vex did a great job at managing those by providing him with high health regen, movement speed, and escape options. Urn of Shadows was still his most popular first item, but surprisingly, a Spirit Vessel saw a noticeable decline in popularity. This was partially because healing reduction had become more accessible, with both Shiva's Guard and Eye of Skadi now carrying the effect, but also because players wanted to buy Hand of Midas again. The International 10 was a very slow-paced tournament, centered around lengthy farming periods only interrupted by Roshan fights. This gave Invoker plenty of time to both purchase and use Hand of Midas to build a lead. However, he couldn't completely rush it, then he would have given his opponents an opening to take an early Roshan kill. Roshan was crucially important because he was by far the highest gold rewarding objective on the map. The second Roshan kill provided a free Aghanim shard, and the third either a free Aghanim scepter or a one-time refresher orb. These rewards were valuable and worth contesting, but they were also quite specific. It was important for all teams to have at least one hero that actually wanted these rewards, and that's where Invoker came in, who appreciated all of them. He got great use out of Shard, Scepter, and Refresher at all stages of the game, so much so that it wasn't unusual for him to just outright buy these items instead. But of course, free was better, and so early and frequent Roshan challenges were commonplace. To be ready for these potential challenges, Invoker usually bought some early fighting items like upgraded boots, Null Talisman, Magic Wand, Urn of Shadows, and sometimes still a full Spirit Vessel. Hand of Midas only came afterwards, which meant that he often only got it at 15 minutes or even later. This would have been unthinkable during earlier years, but again, TI-10 was really slow. Invoker also didn't have any other pressing items anymore. Before, he would have had to rush Aghanim Scepter, but that wasn't necessary anymore with his updated ultimate. As long as he found enough levels, Invoke would have a low cooldown anyways. Quas Vex was his strongest early game fighting build. While in theory Quas Exhort or even Vex Exhort would have been better for farming, Quas Vex was really good at Roshan fights. Tornado scouted and disabled any units in the pit from a huge distance away, and EMP then dampened the team's long-term fighting capabilities. Like before, high levels of Vex also strengthened Alacrity, which was useful for buffing, specifically Tiny, who was yet again a monster at TI-10. Once Invoker reached level 9 or so, he then started going all in on Exhort to ensure he had a breadth of spells available. His late game item build was then centered around the usual utility: BKB, Blink Dagger, Hex, and also pretty frequently Aghanim Scepter. While Aghanims wasn't mandatory anymore, that didn't mean it was bad. Cataclysm was still immensely dangerous, and even the triple Meteor Shard saw some use. Invoker was just really strong. There was no secret, no trick, no surprise strategy. Everything that in the past he had to work for, he was now given for free. At the International 10, Invoker was the 5th most contested hero, at 142 games, about 73% of the tournament. Unfortunately though, he then suffered the fate of the strongest. He was banned in the vast majority of games, and the only times he was let through was when his opponents felt confident in their ability to beat him. This mostly meant they had enough disables and catch to lock him down, and that they could open up their supports for early ganking rotations. And so Invoker had a terrible 37% win rate. This was obviously disappointing, but I would like to argue in favor of Invoker. The games I saw painted a picture of a powerful hero that was rightfully almost permanently banned. Invoker's next year was defined by a variety of smaller balance adjustments to his abilities and talents. Going through all of them would be tedious, so let's focus on the most important ones. Vex had its movement speed bonus decreased by 20%, a major nerf. In turn, Invoker gained 10 base movement speed. Similarly, Ghostwalk had both its lower and upper end pulled closer together. One of the advantages of Quas Vex had always been how quick Invoker moved with high levels of Vex, and this was aimed at limiting that. Then his Forged Spirits were buffed. Their armor reduction started scaling with Exhort, and their maximum armor reduction was changed to now cap after 20 stacks as opposed to 20 armor lost. This meant they could now go all the way up to minus 30 armor, a huge amount. Then Invoker gained a talent that gave the Forged Spirits plus 50 attack speed. Sunstrike and Deafening Blast also had their damage increased, and Chaos Meteor had its bonus damage talent moved to level 20 and buffed appropriately. While these changes may seem minor, keep in mind that Invoker used a lot of spells per fight now, meaning even small increases added up quickly. The International 11 was business as usual for Invoker. He was a strong laner that was vulnerable to ganks and scaled well into the late game. Since the stronger Quas Vex got nerfed and the weaker Quas Exhort buffed, now both styles saw play, although slightly skewed towards Quas Exhort. Roshan's rewards had been reduced, which also made Quas Vex less valuable since fights weren't all centered around the pit anymore. Both styles were much the same as before, with some slight variations. Quas Vex started incorporating Witchblade as an optional alternative to Urn of Shadows, and Quas Exhort leaned more heavily towards a fast Blink Dagger for better Chaos Meteor and Forged Spirit positioning. Due to their recent buffs, the Forged Spirits were quite strong now, strong enough to even matter in mid to late game fights. The 50% increase to their armor reduction really made all the difference. Heroes targeted by Forged Spirits were quickly forced to retreat, as otherwise they would die instantly if the carry's attention turned to them. The Forged Spirits were also useful when it came to dealing with Wraith Pact, the single most important item of the tournament. Wraith Pact summoned a damage-reducing totem that needed to be killed quickly. While Invoker wouldn't usually be the one to kill the opposing Wraith Pact by himself, since he wanted to sit far away from it to not get hit by the debuff, he and his Forged Spirits both had long enough attack range and could have decent attack speed, meaning it was easy for him to chip away at it if it got into range. At TI 11, Invoker settled back into his comfortable role of being a good, solid hero that was used by those that appreciated his eccentric nature. Unfortunately, the meta had shifted slightly to be worse for him. Roshan no longer dropped an Aghanim's Shard, which stopped the meta from being entirely centered around him. This invalidated Invoker's use as a reward carrier, and since early Roshan fights weren't as common, supports had more time to gank the mid, as they needed to keep themselves busy. Overall, Invoker was contested in 64 games, about 27% of the tournament with a 47% win rate. An absolutely fine performance in line with what we had seen before, but nothing outstanding. After TI 11, patch 7.33 was released. Patch 7.33 introduced a new, much larger map to Dota 2 with an abundance of creeps to farm as well as a variety of new objectives. It also, for the first time ever, brought a new main attribute: Universal. Universal heroes benefited equally from strength, agility and intelligence, gaining 0.6 damage per point of each of them. A large number of existing heroes had their primary attribute changed to Universal, and consequently their stats adjusted downwards. At first, Universal heroes were quite lackluster, as their weaker attributes had them struggle against more specialized characters. But then, in 7.33c, Universal heroes started gaining 0.7 damage per attribute point, and suddenly they became incredibly powerful, as their natural attack damage growth outperformed the vast majority of other characters. Invoker wasn't one of those powerful Universal heroes, he remained Intelligence. He did, however, receive a variety of other changes. His triple Chaos Meteor Aghanim's Shard was moved to a level 20 talent, and he gained a new Aghanim's Shard. It now upgraded EMP, increasing its damage and making it pull enemies towards the center of it as it charged up. This was a very disruptive ability, as ignoring the pull quickly resulted in getting forced into very awkward positioning. Invoker also gained a point of starting strength, Chaos Meteor had its damage boosted, Cold Snap its duration reduced, and Tornado gained early travel distance. Then, in a surprise twist, Invoker became a universal hero in patch 7.34. He was the only hero to receive this treatment. As a result of this, he received a large number of changes to his general attributes. His base health regen was increased, his base damage decreased, his agility gain decreased, his base intelligence increased, his intelligence gain decreased, and his damage at level 1 decreased. These are the kinds of adjustments all universal heroes went through, as becoming universal resulted in a massive increase in damage gain per level. Universal heroes scaled like crazy for the entire match. Throughout Dota's history, there's always been a cheeky debate about which attribute was best. Strength allowed for good usage of Heart and Satanic. Agility heroes had the highest physical DPS since they could scale their attack speed and damage at the same time, and Intelligence heroes had abundant mana for their spells. But 7.33c settled that debate. Universal heroes were the best. There was no question about it. Universal heroes scaled quicker with a broader range of items than anyone else. As an example, universal heroes gained 46 damage from Ioscadi, while others only gained 22. Universal heroes could turn utility or defensive items into noteworthy sources of damage. As part of becoming universal, Invoker's orbs had the attributes they provided cut in half. They also received a fundamental rework to how they provided him with bonuses. Instead of passively providing health regeneration, attack speed, and damage when summoned, the orbs now enhanced his spells. Quas provided spell lifesteal, Vex cooldown reduction, and Exhort spell amplification. These bonuses were added as Invoker cast his spells, regardless of what he used to invoke them. This is a bit complicated, so here's an example. If Invoker used Exhort to invoke Sunstrike, then nothing new happened. He just had Sunstrike queued up now. If he now wanted to cast Sunstrike, then he could modify the ability by changing the orbs he had currently summoned. So he could now swap over to Quas and then cast the already invoked Sunstrike to give it spell lifesteal. Or he could use Vex to give Sunstrike cooldown reduction or stick with Exhort to give it spell amplification. This value was stored when Invoker cast a spell, meaning he couldn't start with Vex to get the cooldown reduction on cast and then swap to Exhort afterwards for more damage. Of course, these bonuses could be freely combined. If he wanted a bit of each, then that was also possible. This change to the orbs made Invoker even more complex to play than he was before, although not as much as you might expect. It quickly became obvious that cooldown reduction was by far the most valuable bonus for Invoker, as it let him cast his spells more frequently. Especially so because Vex was also the only bonus that applied to items, making it even better. And so Invokers would usually try to cast their spells with as much Vex bonus as the situation allowed. Aside from that, his abilities also received some noteworthy buffs. Cold Snap had its stun interval reduced and started healing Invoker for twice the damage it dealt. Similarly, Ghostwalk now provided him with substantial health and mana regeneration. Tornado and Sunstrike were also strengthened early, and Tornado, Alacrity, and Deafening Blast each had their mana costs reduced. Finally, his level 25 bonuses talent was nerfed. 7.34 was a very eventful patch for Invoker, and as a result of it, he received many adjustments over the next few latter patches. In 7.34b, he lost a point of base armor, Vex cooldown reduction no longer worked on items, Ghostwalk had its regeneration cut in half and paused for 3 seconds if Invoker took hero damage, and his talents were nerfed. 7.34c then nerfed his base health regeneration, movement speed per Vex orb summoned, and EMP shard and tornado base damage. And finally, 7.34d nerfed his health regen even more, reduced the healing from Cold Snap and the mana restoration from EMP. And then it was time for the next International. The International 10 and 11 had already been dominated by a slow-paced and farming-centric metagame. Patch 7.33 then introduced more creeps to farm and a larger map that made it easier to hide. It also added new objectives that could lead to fast pushes, but most teams took the expected approach and focused on farming. The average game length of the International 12 was the longest since the very first one. More creep camps, Wisdom runes, Tormentors, Roshan, Bounty runes, Hand of Midas, and becoming universal. Never before did Invoker have access to this many resources or scale as much and as powerfully into the late game as now. Quas Vex with a fast Spirit Vessel remained his most popular early game build, but Quas Exhort also saw some play, and even Support Invoker made a minor return. But no matter the style, Vex became the most important aspect of his toolkit. Spells cast with maxed Vex orbs summoned had their cooldowns reduced by 21%. This added a whole new dimension to Invoker. Many abilities that had previously been limited to only once per fight suddenly became frequent casts. Even more so if he managed to slot an Octarine core into his inventory for additional cooldown reduction. If he was a spell slinger before, now he became a spell machine gun, casting his powerful invocations with seemingly no cooldown at all. But that's assuming he managed to summon Vex before a cast. In practice, that wasn't always possible. Invoker had already been difficult to play, but his new orbs demanded even more from the players. While they certainly tried to optimize their spells, often they had to settle for faster casts as opposed to perfect ones. But even when they missed their perfect invocations, his spells remained incredibly dangerous. Cooldown reduction may have been the optimal buff, but Spell Amp and Spell Lifesteal weren't half bad either. Even in the worst possible scenario, Invoker spells were the most powerful they had ever been. But another buff he had received manifested in an entirely new approach. Invoker was universal now, which meant even if he didn't buy any attack damage items, he was able to put out serious right-click power. And if he did, then he was a legitimate contender. Right-click Invoker was an ever-present threat, because Invoker could hedge his early item build to be able to pivot into it depending on what his team needed from him. Hand of Midas was already fantastic for Invoker because he wanted it for farming, but it also provided some attack speed. And he started incorporating Force Staff as an early utility and movement tool, which could then be upgraded into Hurricane Pike for additional attack range and stats if necessary. This let him scale as a powerful caster that could, at any point, transition into a right-click build with BKB and even Daedalus. And even if he didn't do that, his regular attacks, enhanced by Alacrity, dealt significant damage. Invoker could do more than ever before, and he found himself in a metagame that fully enabled him. With all this gold and experience on the map, he could farm however much he wanted to, and he was happy to embrace that. Games at the International 12 were already long, but Invoker games pushed this even further. Over 46 minutes on average. Teams that drafted Invoker dirtled into the late game, where they then relied on his power to force a victory. While simple, this was an incredibly effective strategy that put Invoker center stage. He was contested in 112 matches, over 74% of the tournament. He was the 6th most popular hero with a solid 52% win rate. Invoker was stronger than ever before in an environment that fully embraced him. Tournament winners Team Spirit played him 5 times, winning all of those games. Invoker started his Dota 2 journey as a bit of a failed concept. His core idea of creating and casting a vast range of different spells couldn't function because of the long cooldown of Invoke. That's not to say that he wasn't good. His invocations were incredibly powerful in a broad range of situations. At TI2, that was in a defensively minded semi-carry, semi-support style, and at TI4 he embraced pushing with Forge Spirits and Necronomicon. However, like many heroes, Invoker didn't adjust well to the changes from 6.82. And then dual mid lanes became common, which he struggled against. That's not to say that he was bad, but he also didn't shine. During this era, Invoker received many important buffs that gave him extra levels and lowered Invoke's cooldown to get him ready for when his time would finally come. That fated tournament ended up being the International 8. All of the most legendary Invoker players had assembled, and they put on a clinic of wonderful, beautiful play that cannot be described, only witnessed. Invoker had finally become what he was always meant to be. A fast-paced, stylish spell slinger who dominated fights with his carefully placed and well-timed abilities. While he was never the most popular hero among players, some embraced him fully and were rewarded for their efforts. Then, things quieted down for a bit, until Invoker took the meta by storm at TI10 on the back off of a balancing mistake that made Cold Snap arguably the single strongest disable in the game. Cold Snap was so powerful that Invoker was even played as a support for the first time ever. Another quiet year followed before Invoker received a soft rework that turned him into a universal hero with even more powerful spells than before. Now Invoker could cast spells to dominate teamfights, attack to challenge carries, and smoothly transition between the two roles without much trouble. From the very beginning, Invoker has been one of a kind. No other character casts spells like Invoker, scaled like Invoker, played like Invoker. But during the early years, Valve were tepid to embrace this kind of uniqueness, and they made him obey the same laws as everybody else. Over time, Invoker slowly but surely lost more and more of those shackles until he finally became free. On this journey, he had many years of stellar performances, and he was favored by both audiences and tournament champions. Across Dota history, Invoker was one of our greatest heroes, both in the game and in our hearts. Thank you very much for watching the story of Invoker. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is the last regular Stories of Dota video. And before I tell you what we're doing next, I think I owe you guys an explanation. Stories of Dota was never intended to be a permanent YouTube channel. Instead, the goal of it was to document the first 10 or so years of Dota 2's history. Because a lot of that history was already being lost. There are a bunch of games and articles that are really difficult to find, if not just lost media at this point. And I was worried that that would continue and eventually the history of it all would just fade away. And wouldn't that be unfortunate? Dota is such a beautiful game and so much has happened, and I think it's important that we can remember what actually happened. But Stories of Dota was always limited to that scope. We never had plans to make videos about every single Dota hero. And honestly speaking, I think expecting us to do that was a bit unreasonable. I mean, that would have taken over 10 years. That's a lot of videos. But I'm glad that you guys enjoyed the videos that we made. And I am glad that we found a good moment to end it. A moment where we felt like we have told everything that we wanted to tell. The videos now document the history of Dota 2 in a way that it feels close enough to complete that we feel satisfied. And now we can move on to make one last video that should hopefully fill all of the remaining gaps of information that are worth documenting. Because that's what the next video is. That's what's the final video for this channel. The next video is going to be the story of Dota 2. It's just going to be about the entire story of the game. It's a bit of a big one, so this video right here is less than half as long as the video that we are currently working on for the final kind of closing video for the channel. And the story of Dota 2 will unfortunately probably be a little bit delayed because of it. It is over 30,000 words long, which is pretty intense. It is over 50% longer than our longest video, being the IO video. And I think that you can probably expect the video to be around 3 to 3.5 hours. So as a result of that, it's going to take a little while longer. We don't expect to be done on the regular schedule. I hope that's okay. But I do also hope that you guys will enjoy it. I hope you guys enjoyed going on this journey through Dota's history with us. And I hope that you learned something. And I hope that you find it now easier to appreciate the early days of Dota. I know that we still weren't able to tell every story there is in Dota. Unfortunately, that was never gonna be possible. I know that Dota 2 isn't just the international, and that's the framing device we used here. But at the end of the day, we had to make some concessions to be able to actually make the videos, right? So keep that in mind. Nothing is perfect, nothing is complete, but I'm still very proud of what we have accomplished here. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys look forward to the final video, the story of Dota 2. I'll see you then.